Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Unfiltered Author Talks. This is one I'm very excited for, and I hope you are as well. A. Wilson Greene has joined us today to talk about his newest book, A Campaign of Giants, The Battle of Petersburg, Volume 2, From the Crater's Aftermath to the Battle of Burgess Mill. Will, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to have you on.
I appreciate you asking me, Tyler. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I had just come off the heels of reading your first book last year and saw this one was coming out, and I knew I was like, I've got to reach out to Will and talk about this because the first book was just amazing, and you really kept my attention the entire time, which is awesome because I have the attention span of a squirrel. So it was great to be able to read something as fluid as your book was, and so I knew that when Volume 2 was coming out, it was something that I immediately needed to go after. I didn't know I'd get to have an opportunity such as this to read it and talk to you about it a bit, so this is great. But before we get started into the book talk, though, if you would like to take some time to introduce yourself to our viewers here.
Well, sure, Tyler. This Petersburg project has kind of made my career in public history come full circle because my first job in history was as a seasonal ranger at Petersburg National Battlefield.
Oh, no
I was there for 3 different seasons while I was going to graduate school at LSU. And then I was able to get on full time with the National Park Service, which employed me for about 16 years, particularly at Fredericksburg, at Petersburg, Shenandoah, Gulf Islands National Seashore, and down at Chalmette National Historical Park in New Orleans, and at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. But in 1987, a bunch of historians, and myself included, brought together by a fellow named Don Fons, who's an author of his own right, about battlefield preservation. We met in my living room in July of 1987, and out of that meeting came the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites. And I took a leave of absence from the Park Service in 1990 to be the executive director of that organization, which I did for 5 years. And of course, APCWS, the world's worst acronym, morphed into the American Battlefield Trust. And so we're very proud, all of us who were kind of the founding guys who really didn't know what we were doing, but we were just mad as hell and weren't going to take it anymore.
Right.
We're so pleased with what the American Battlefield Trust has done. One of the projects that we had at APCWS was working with Robert Pamplin to preserve a 200-acre site at Petersburg where the Sixth Corps breakthrough took place on April 2nd, 1865. And that just grew to something that was amazing. Pamplin was willing to put in millions and millions of dollars in this site. And so I decided that I would take up his offer to become the director of what is now Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier, which I served at since until 2017, from 1995 to 2017. And I retired. And now I'm serving my life sentence writing these books about Petersburg.
And if I'm not mistaken, you're the first to really take a crack at writing a large-scale coverage of Petersburg. And most folks have done it in a single volume, and I'm not saying that anything was short or long, but you're really taking the dive into really telling the story of the fighting and I don't know if you want to call it a siege or not, but just the operations around Petersburg. Like, you're the first one to really take a crack at that.
Well, I guess that's right. For a long time, there was very little written about Petersburg. Now that has been rectified over the last 15 years or so. There's been a number of very fine monographs on aspects of the Petersburg campaign. Earl Hess did a very good 1-volume history of the campaign, focusing on fortifications. And Andy Trudeau back in the 90s did a 1-volume history of the campaign, kind of using quotations to tell the story. But we never really had an operational level history of this very complex campaign. And I tried to, over the years, tried to talk to people about maybe trying to undertake this project. Nobody bit. So I guess I was the one who had to do it. I started this, Tyler, in 2006.
2006.
So it's almost been 20 years, and I'm still not done. This is a, this is a major project. I mean, the
Hmm.
campaign lasted 292 days. Involved dozens and dozens of actions, and and it covers 570 square miles. I mean, it's the largest campaign of the Civil War. So it's to do it right. You have to take some time.
Oh, agreed. And so, what when you started Volume One? Let's just backtrack to that before we get into Volume Two. There, how long did Volume One take? You know, you said 2006. Like, where did it start? How did you decide? You know what? I'm going to sit down. I'm finally going to write this. Like, where did Volume One come
Well,
into?
I did. I back in I guess when did I publish this? Maybe in the early 2000s. I wrote a book about the final battles of the Petersburg
Hmm.
Campaign. And so I had some of that research done. And but to take the whole scope, I said I started the research on that in 2006, and Volume One came out in 2018. So it took 12 years. If you're going to do this right, I'm kind of old school. I went to graduate school in the 1970s before computers and before databases and all of that good stuff. So I'm old school. I like to go to the repositories,
Hmm.
go to the archives, and look at the documents and try to be as comprehensive as I can be. Now, I certainly would never claim that I have covered all the sources on Petersburg, but I'm trying. And I've probably gone to 50 different archives in the course of doing this research.
Wow.
So it takes a lot of time. You figure you have, what, 150,000 men writing letters for 9.5 months. So that
You got
gives you a
some
lot of
source there,
primary sources,
right?
a lot of primary sources, as well as the post-war regimental histories and the memoirs and so forth. So it's a huge literature on Petersburg.
Yeah. And so, have any of your research taken you on the battlefield again? Because I know you were at Pamplin for quite some time. Did this bring you back to some of the Petersburg battlefields?
Absolutely. I'm a believer, as I'm sure all good military historians are, that you have to study the terrain in
Hmm.
order to really understand what happened. And one of the great things about Petersburg is that it has not been developed like your part of Northern Virginia has.
Right.
If around Fredericksburg or Manassas, where you work and live,
Hmm.
if it's not preserved, it's pretty much gone by now.
That's right.
Not true at Petersburg, and the preservation itself has gotten a lot better. There's been a lot of work done by a number of organizations, including the American Battlefield Trust, particularly, to preserve the individual battlefields. But even the places that aren't preserved are still pristine.
Hmm.
And with permission from landowners, you can get out and see the terrain features that, in many cases, as your listeners no doubt know, dictate the course of a battle. You have to understand the terrain in order to understand why people did what they did on the battlefield. So I make a habit of going around and trying to tromp around every place that I write about.
Awesome. I absolutely agree with you there. I had an opportunity a few years ago with the Petersburg Battlefield Foundation to visit Fort Emery, which seemed to be in a gentleman's driveway. And that blew my mind. We pulled up to this guy's house, and there's an entire fort right on the edge of his driveway. And
Right.
but I mean that to me started the interest too, because I'm like, oh my gosh, the scale of this battle or this entire campaign is tremendous. I mean, it was something that was eye opening to me, and I'm sure you've seen some of these forts, and that's something many of the forts don't even see combat, but the fact that they're still there, coming
There's
from Fredericksburg to Petersburg, and there being forts around, and I'm like, well, we don't have that in Fredericksburg. We're lucky if we have a lip of a trench in someone's front yard.
oh
We
the
full
yeah
fort.
the physical remains of the Petersburg campaign are unparalleled, I think. And also, I include the actions north of the James River as part of the
Hmm.
campaign. It's all, in a perfect world, the Richmond National Battlefield Park and the Petersburg National Battlefield would have been combined
Yeah,
into one, because there's a lot of what I cover in Volume Two and in Volume One occurred north of the James River.
that's
So,
right.
and that part of Henrico and Hanover County is now we're losing the fight out there, but there's still a lot of rural land there that allows you, like around Deep Bottom, for example,
Hmm.
allows you to see the terrain as it was in the 1860s.
Are there a lot of extant fortifications still there, or
There
yeah?
are a lot of the earthworks are still there. There are some of the forts that are up on Newmarket Heights that are in private hands that are still extant, and of course the Richmond National Battlefield Park. Thanks to people like J. Ambler Johnston and Douglas Southall Freeman in the 1930s, purchased a lot of the existing fortifications. So when you drive the tour road at Richmond Battlefield out by Fort Harrison, for example, you're traversing a lot of the original Confederate defense lines.
Oh, no kidding. We have a couple comments here. I have Dan Casella asking, "Is the ground where the First New Jersey Brigade was in line with the Sixth Corps during the breakthrough preserved?"
Yes, that is not part of Pamplin Historical Park, but for the most part, that ground is not developed. There is a large, unfortunately, there's a large steel recycling plant that went in the early 2000s
Mhm.
that on the east side of Church Road, if your listener knows where that is, and that has compromised a lot of that breakthrough area.
Yeah.
But the Confederate line is pretty much intact. In fact, you can walk the Confederate line from Petersburg, from the city of Petersburg, all the way down to Hatcher's Run, with only maybe 15 to 20% of that line missing.
Wow.
It's amazing, yeah.
That
And
is.
most of it is not actively preserved.
Wow. We have Nathan on Facebook, enjoying going back through the first volume of A Campaign of Giants. Great research. Thank you for coming on and sharing your experience writing the series. It's unfortunate that Deep Bottom is not accessible to the public.
Well, Deep Bottom is accessible to the public. There are the Deep Bottom itself is a boat landing now
I saw that.
that you can drive to and see the river there at the Big Bend. But there are parts of the Deep Bottom battlefield that the American Battlefield Trust has preserved, especially around Fussell's Middle. And you can see there's a great line of earthworks that are there. I don't know that it's well interpreted at this point. That's something that I wish the preservation organizations would do, and the American Battlefield Trust is doing a much better job of that than they used to.
Yeah.
But there are meaningful parts of both first and second Deep Bottom that you can visit.
Very cool. Yeah, second Deep Bottom is one that I have on my radar too to go visit. I was doing some Google Earth touring, if you will, because I'm doing it from the comfort of an armchair at the moment. But I saw that there was a boat ramp there, and I was like, wow, I could actually get right down to the river itself. And is
Oh,
that pretty close to where the ship or the boats were coming up and actually offloading some of the troops there?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And on private property, there's one of the bridges was built at a place called Tillman's Landing,
Mhm.
and that is pristine. Now it's on private property, and the landowners were very nice when I called, I asked to bring a group down there. But yeah, that riverfront is still very very pristine. Now the
Good.
land across the river, Jones Neck, as it was known, is not very accessible. That's pretty swampy,
No. Okay.
uh, and so I don't think you can replicate the Union troops that came across Jones Neck and crossed at Deep Bottom. But you can certainly get a flavor of that terrain by going to the boat landing there on the James.
Yeah. Very cool. And so just one more circle back to the first volume, because it does take us all the way through the crater. And I think, I've read a few books on the crater. I've read Hess's study on the crater and a few others, but yours is really, again, one of the most readable and approachable from a book size like that. And it really hit home as a Virginian trying to read about the carnage of the crater, visiting the crater as much as I have. I never really had a clear picture because it is a confusing battle. If you just step foot on the NPS battlefield and you're not really connecting the Taylor farm all the way to the the crater itself, and where I believe it's Elliott Salient that's going to be the brunt of where the explosion happens. It's hard to picture that on your first few visits, but reading your book, like I'm equipped now to go back to the battlefield again very soon here, and just really take in the terrain more than I ever have been.
Well,
Well, yeah.
I've always been, always had regrets that the National Park Service has not interpreted the Battle of the Crater from the Confederate standpoint. In other words, to bring visitors up to the crater as the Confederate attacks occurred. And they own all that land, almost all that land. And I've taken private groups out there. You have to tromp through the woods. But the ravine that was so instrumental in serving as a jump-off point for the Confederate attackers there is still there.
Okay.
The intersection of the two ravines, one was a ravine, one was a covered way built out of a ravine, where Mahone was standing and gesticulating and encouraging the men to go forward and save the day. You can stand right there today. So for intrepid hikers, especially when the leaves are off the trees or the snakes aren't out there and the ticks aren't biting, it's very possible to walk on Park Service land, to go out and see the battle from the Confederate standpoint. And I think that really helps. The Park Service interprets the explosion very well, the construction of the mine, but you don't really get the flavor of the combat, I don't think.
No, I agree, and that's something I didn't even know they had that an extent of holding there with the Confederate line. So I might have to, especially when, like you said, the weather gets a little better or more hikeable, if you will. We'll go back out there, but I'm not a big fan of the snakes and ticks and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. Some people might be, we don't know, but I definitely going to wait for that. But that's something I think, again, that you tell this story from not only the Union approach, but you give the Confederate side of the attack as well. And I think it's instrumental to understanding how the crater really plays out, because if you only know one side of it, you're not really going to be able to grasp the entire battle that takes place there and how ferocious it gets, and the determination of the Confederates to regain that work.
It was almost, I won't say unprecedented, because there were many horrible hand-to-hand combats in the American Civil War, but the crater is probably right up there with the most brutal.
Yeah.
And I'm something of I guess I'm not trying to be falsely modest here, but I don't know that I'm breaking all that much new ground with these books. What I'm trying to do is use new voices to tell familiar stories. So someone who reads about the crater, who's read Earl Hess's fine book on the crater, for example, and you read my stuff, and it's pretty familiar. But I try to use as often as I can to use firsthand accounts, unpublished accounts, and ones that other authors haven't used. And that's certainly the case in volume 2. As I say in my introduction in that book, I owe a great deal to 3 authors, John Horn, Richard Summers, and Hampton Newsom, who have written outstanding books on the 4th, 5th, and 6th Petersburg offensives, which is what my second volume covers. I just hope that I do their good work justice, and that I maybe tell the story with a few fresh voices.
Absolutely. And like I was speaking to you a little bit before we went live there, like I have a John Horn book as well that I'm someone who I supplement my reading, just because if I'm reading a battle, I like to get different voices, kind of like you were saying. And I have that. I've had a Richard Summers book on my shelf for a very long time. And someone looked at me and told me that it was going to be the cure to insomnia, so I should wait to read it. And that's my reaction now, because like, all right, fine, I'll study some of the Overland Campaign. But getting into Petersburg, his book has made it to one of the top of my to be read piles. Absolutely.
And I don't know if you know this, Tyler, but that's about 50% of his dissertation.
No.
If you really, when people say, I've had some criticism about, my book is, too detailed, all this, who cares about this? Well, Dick Summers wrote 2,000 pages on 4 days. And that's detailed. But Richmond Redeemed, his book on the 5th Offensive, is really easy to follow. It's very logical, and his maps are wonderful. Dick Summers, was a dear friend of mine. In fact, I dedicated volume 2 to Dick. He was a unique individual, and Dick Summers knew more about the American Civil War than any living person.
No kidding.
He was just an incredible guy.
I'm looking forward to his book too. I've heard so many good things about it, and like I said, that one comment kind of rushed through my head at this point. I'm like, I don't know why maybe someone wasn't thrilled with it, but it seems like maybe they're not a Petersburg person. I get that.
Well, if you're not, I mean, these books and mine too. For a general reader who's just vaguely interested in American history, this is Dick Summers' book and even my books are probably not the place to start.
Right.
They're a little more geared towards people who already have an interest and some familiarity with the American Civil War's military history.
Absolutely. And so that brings us to volume 2. Now, so you said volume 1 came out in 2018. This one just came out in was it April 8th, just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, this is fresh out there. Speaking of, where can our listeners get that? If I would like to put that in the video too, so people can grab it. Where would you recommend folks picking that book up at?
Well, it was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and they have a website, and I'm sure they would be delighted if people would order from them. Of course, you can go to the usual place for books. Amazon sells it, and I would imagine that after a while, I would hope that most of the battlefield parks, at least in the East, would carry the book. I know they did with volume 1, but go to the UNC website or Amazon, and I'm sure you can get the book right away.
Good. And so you start out with the aftermath of the crater almost immediately, and it goes into some pretty grim detail of what the salient was like at that time. And this is just after July 31st. It's a very, very rough looking area, and the soldiers are sort of feeling, or at least some of the Confederates almost feel still determined to fight. Where do you think this determination still comes from? Is it because of the results of the crater? Or are they looking at maybe Grant a different way now than they were at the start of the campaign?
Well, I think one of the sub-themes of volume 2, Tyler, is the transition of the campaign from one of Confederate optimism, based on a series of victories, to things looking pretty grim at the end of volume 2 for the Confederate cause. So after the crater, I mean, that was considered a tremendous victory for the Army of Northern Virginia and for William Mahone's troops. Of course, that was exacerbated by fighting United States colored troops.
Right.
And I think anybody who's familiar with American Civil War realizes that there was an awful lot of antipathy towards black troops by the Confederates, and the literature is just full of that. So the Confederates were feeling pretty good about their fate. You think about what was going on in the end of July, 1st of August in 1864. Well, Lee was winning victories at Petersburg and Richmond. Joe Johnston and Hood were still holding off Sherman outside of Atlanta. There were operating ports in Wilmington and Mobile. The Confederates in Trans-Mississippi were about ready to go on the offensive and reinvade Missouri.
Yeah.
So, things were looking, pretty good, like the Confederacy was going to be able to survive. And by the end of the 6th offensive, the end of my book here at the end of October, things don't look so good for the Confederates anymore. No. Sherman has taken Atlanta, and he's about ready to march to the sea. Mobile Bay has been captured by the Union Navy and cut off as a port. And the Sterling Price is about to get his lunch handed to him out in Missouri and Kansas. Only at Petersburg and Richmond was the Confederate force really doing well, but they were hanging on by their fingernails. And sort of my cliffhanger for the end of Volume 2 is the reliance that the Confederates had on the election coming in 1864 November.
That's
And
right.
that's where I'll start Volume 3. There's a wealth of material on soldier attitudes toward the election, both the Federal soldiers and Confederate soldiers. Some of
Okay.
it pretty surprising, and but not to give away the secret, but a lot of the Confederates were hoping that the election would be their savior,
Right.
which would make their independence more possible.
And I think that speaks to the testament of maybe the mindset that they don't think that the war is going to go in their favor. They're hoping that an election is going to be their savior. That definitely speaks to the situation the Confederates find themselves in late '64, early '65 for sure.
Well, the literature, if you just all you have to do is read Robert E. Lee's correspondence
Mm-hmm.
with the president and with the Secretary of War. Lee is a realist, and he understands that he is facing corps with divisions now,
Right.
and if he doesn't get some reinforcement to his army and better supplies, Lee is beginning to see that he's in extremis.
Yeah.
That's not to say that he's giving up, but he's recognizing that there are some real problems by the end of October of '64.
And you start the book out again with the aftermath of the crater. One thing I found fascinating that I had very little knowledge of was what's happening at City Point too. There's this giant explosion at City Point in its own right. And you covered that phenomenally, by the way. I really appreciated that aspect of your book too. Was there a lot of research out there on that? Is there a lot of primary source on the explosion there, or is it kind of something that falls through the cracks of this campaign? You have something like the crater, and then Deep Bottom almost following that afterwards. So this is sort of right in between those two.
Yeah.
But again, you covered that so well and really brought almost a weaving to that story. So I found that.
Thank you. That's an amazing act of terrorism, is what it
Yeah.
was. Confederate secret agent. Literally, I mean, he's part of the Secret Service of the Confederacy. Sneaks on board a transport vessel loaded with black powder, sets off what he calls a horological torpedo.
Mm-hmm.
We would call it a time bomb, and it blows up and kills hundreds of people, wounds a number of others, and almost he gets Ulysses S. Grant. Some of the debris from the explosion lands right near Grant's tent at City Point. And they don't really know what happened until after the war. So yeah, that's a very interesting episode that could have changed history if that shell fragment or that debris had gone 3 or 4 feet in a different direction. It could have taken out the general in chief of Union armies.
Absolutely. And that's something that, it's not, I don't want to say widely publicized, but it's not something that many Civil War folks automatically know about when you think of the Petersburg campaign, that Grant endures a terrorist attack, literally at City Point. And
Right.
I think one of his aides, Babcock, is even wounded by that, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. That's right.
So it's affecting him a certain way. But I think one thing to Grant's testament there is that he's there quick enough. And I believe he's visiting in Washington right before this happens, and is back in time for this explosion. And this is just a few days from the crater happening. So that, I think he knew where the focus really needed to be, and made
Well,
it.
he did, and I think that one of the aspects of Volume 2 that readers might find to be fresh, maybe they didn't realize. I don't think I realized it until I was doing the research for it, is how concerned Grant was about Sheridan and the Valley. In many ways, I don't want to overstate this, but in many ways, Petersburg, the actions at Petersburg were sort of a support action for Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. And I don't know that you read that in too many places, but the sources are there to prove it. Grant is constantly concerned about making sure that Sheridan gets the troops he needs, making sure that Lee is not sending troops out to the Shenandoah Valley or bringing troops back from the valley. He doesn't have that same concern about Sherman.
No.
Although part of the Petersburg story is keeping Lee from sending reinforcements to other theaters. As you know, this is exactly what Lee does at Chickamauga. He sends Longstreet to Georgia, and guess what? The Confederates win their only victory in the Western Theater
Right.
because of that. And Grant is fully aware of that and is always wanting to pin Lee down. But he is very concerned, probably over concerned in some ways, with Sheridan's fate in the Shenandoah Valley. So you can't understand what happens at Petersburg in the summer and early fall of 1864 unless you understand what's going on in the Shenandoah Valley.
I think that's perfect because that's something I gathered as soon as you started into Deep Bottom. And again, I don't mean to just throw the topic onto Grant here, but it changed the way I thought of him because I've never really been fully on Grant's side with a lot of things. This was the first time I really started to see him as just a genius individual, even because Deep Bottom stops Lee, like you just said, from really sending those forces. I mean, almost in route. Like I believe, is it Field that's on his way to the valley and has to pivot back to stop the
Right.
Unions? Yeah, so there things that I would have never even thought of. So that's one thing I love about your book there. And Weldon Railroad itself, I believe, is also tied to the same. There's a multiple different reasons there for Weldon Railroad, I think. You obviously agree with your
Right.
book too.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Weldon Railroad, Grant grows as a strategist at Petersburg after the crater. I'm a little hard on Grant in Volume 1. And I am a great admirer of Grant.
Right.
But I got some nasty grams from Grant fans from Volume 1. Oh, you're just terrible about Grant. You just hate Grant. Well, I don't hate Grant, but Grant made a lot of he made a lot of mistakes during the first 3 offensives. They were all failures at Petersburg. But he changes his operations after the crater, and it bears fruit. As you just pointed out, he cuts off the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, which is a major accomplishment. And his 5th and 6th offensives, while they didn't succeed in capturing the South Side Railroad or the Boyden Plank Road, which was always his goal, they did succeed in many ways. They kept Confederate troops from going to Sheridan. They expanded the Confederate defense lines as Lee is getting thinner and thinner. And he's cutting off Lee's supply base from the South. So Grant does a much better job in the 4th, 5th, and 6th offensives than he does in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd offensives, as I think readers will discern as they compare the 2 books.
I'm picking up on that too. That's why I wanted to ask you that. I feel like to me, what I'm gathering sort of is that early stages of Petersburg and the first few offensives, Grant, maybe this is trial and error for him. He's trying to figure out test Lee, maybe. I don't want to go that far in saying that, but it's just interesting to see the shift in his generalship and his strategies from the first few offensive to what we see. Because he does attempt Deep Bottom once before, but he doesn't have Sheridan in the valley.
Right.
And Sherman as close as he is at the time. So there is a little bit of a difference there and why that. So I think you're right with that too. There is some success in stopping Lee from sending those troops out, and you really do see Grant shifting.
And that was always part of Grant's thinking. He's not a one-dimensional thinker. And all these offensives, he's got several things in mind, several objectives. Let's not discount his hope, not expectation, but his hope that his offensives north of the James River might actually break into Richmond.
I was going to ask you that next. Is he thinking that maybe if I go through Deep Bottom, worst could happen, we get Richmond? We get Richmond, yeah.
He thinks that that's a possibility. I'm not saying he expects it.
Right.
But he's throwing a right hook and the left jab simultaneously, hoping that he will stretch Lee to the point where either north of the James or south of the Appomattox, the Confederates will break.
Right.
And if they break north of the James, Benjamin Butler could go into Richmond. And it doesn't happen, but it's something that Grant has in the back of his mind. And at the same time, not to beat this dead horse, but
Right.
no pun intended, but he's also trying to keep Sheridan's odds the best they can be out in the valley. So he's got those three things going on all at one time, and he does it masterfully. And Benjamin Butler, for all of his faults, is a he's a C+ general, maybe a B minus. He's not an F. He's not a D. He's certainly not an A. But I think Butler gets a little too much criticism. If you take a look at what he does in those offensives, he performs adequately. He's mediocre in the sense that is average. And so I think that's another thing, another little sub theme of my book is that let's not just get on the bashing Ben Butler bandwagon. Certainly, I don't. Is he one of the great captains? Obviously not.
Right.
But he performs competently in many of those offensives north of the James.
I'd agree. I mean, so far from what I'm reading, I wouldn't have any hesitation to disagree with you there. Not at all. So, with the Weldon Railroad concluding too, and getting into these later offensive, you mentioned, well, really quick to backtrack, you pronounced something differently than I had in my head. It's not Fussel's Mill. What was it? Fussell. Perfect. I want to make sure I know that now when I'm reading through that. So with these two actions out of the way, Deep Bottom's over and Weldon Railroad's over, what is next for Lee at this point? So he loses the Weldon Railroad, and if I'm not mistaken, doesn't Fort Duchesne come out of this engagement too? There's Fort Wadsworth and Fort Duchesne are the two big forts that really kind of spring up.
That's right, Tyler. Yep. Of course, Fort Wadsworth is in the national battlefield, and Fort Duchesne is in pristine condition, and just to the south of Fort Wadsworth. Lee understands that the Weldon Railroad, the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, is a vital transportation communication vehicle for him, and so he is going to orchestrate a counterattack at Ream Station on the 25th of August. Now, I'm not sure that Lee really thinks he's going to be able to drive the Yankees off of the railroad. Right. That would be a nice thing to happen, but he doesn't really think that. He's trying to prevent the Federals from destroying more of the railroad going farther south, because Lee will not abandon the Weldon Railroad entirely. He will just set up a new railhead 18 miles from Petersburg at a depot called Stony Creek, and then wagon his supplies from Stony Creek via existing roads and a military road that he constructs as a shortcut that will connect with the Boyden Plank Road. But the farther south the Yankees go to destroy that railroad, the longer the wagon haul would be for him to use the Weldon Railroad. And at some point, it would become impractical.
Right.
So I think, would Lee love to regain the Weldon Railroad? Yes. But Warren on the 5th Corps is pretty well seated on that railroad. And Lee doesn't attack him. Instead, he attacks the isolated force under Hancock that was there to destroy the railroad farther south. And of course, he succeeds splendidly in that counterattack.
Got an interesting question here on YouTube from John. For all of Warren's faults, was he an A general at Five Forks, but Sheridan's bias saw him as an F general? I know that's not in volume 2, but no. I mean, if you'd like to entertain
that's a
that
fair
one.
Question. There are two battles at the Petersburg campaign that stand out in people's mind. One is the Crater, and the other is Five Forks. And one of the reasons that Five Forks is so well studied is because Phil Sheridan sacks Warren on the spot at the very moment that Warren is riding up victoriously after doing a terrific job in scattering most of Pickett's men along the Ford Church Road there. To answer the viewer's question, no, Warren did not deserve to be sacked at Five Forks. In fact, Warren did a pretty good job at Five Forks, actually. But Warren dug his own grave. He was a difficult a difficult subordinate. And if any of your listeners have ever worked in a large organization, I'm sure they have run across a supervisor someplace or a subordinate who's a know-it-all, always has a better idea, never really agrees with what the program is. And in some ways, that was Gouverneur Kimball Warren. And he got on the wrong side of both Meade and Grant as early as Spotsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know from your study of the Overland Campaign, there was a real chance that Grant gave Meade the authority to get rid of Warren. Meade didn't do it, but Warren was always recalcitrant about making assaults that weren't perfect. If everything wasn't just right, he didn't want to make an attack. He always had a better idea. And I think that when Grant sent his aide out to Sheridan at noon on April 1st and told Sheridan that if he felt that another officer could better lead the Fifth Corps, he was free to fire Warren. That's all that Phil Sheridan needed.
Yeah, it was pretty much nailed in the coffin there. As soon as he was told that was it.
And Sheridan didn't like Warren either. And now, but I'm not a Warren basher. I mean, he had some positive traits, and his troops loved him.
Yeah,
and that's always I'm a Chicago Bears fan, and I remember back in the great Bears team of the 1980s, the funky QB Jim McMahon. Everybody hated McMahon. All the outsiders hated McMahon. He was just a loose cannon, wasn't conformist, but his teammates loved him.
Yeah,
and he was a leader. And in many ways, Warren, not a very popular guy, except with his own troops. And his troops really, really respected him and liked him, and greatly distressed when Warren was relieved. It's one of the tragedies, really, of the Civil War, that Warren never lived to see his reputation exonerated by the Court of Inquiry. It's really kind of sad.
I think he did. I wouldn't say a remarkable job at the Weldon Railroad, but I don't think he performed poorly. The situation he's faced with, of course, there are multiple Confederate forces fighting at that time, and there are a lot of moving parts too when it comes to him trying to connect to the Ninth Corps. But I would honestly say some of those performances at Weldon Railroad outdo some of the performances in the Overland Campaign, even because he is given that change in directives from Grant to where it's no longer just go down, tear up some tracks, and hold the enemy if they attack. He's told if you see them, they're yours, and he does set up troops to combat the Confederates that are there at the Weldon Railroad at the time around Globe Tavern.
I think he did okay at the Weldon Railroad, particularly in the way that he deployed his troops for the last day's battle. But where he got crosswise with Grant was he didn't follow up his victory, and Grant was urging Meade to urge Warren to follow up. I mean, the Confederates really had a terrible beating on August 21st, the last day, but Warren wouldn't go forward, and we'll never know what would have happened. But that's the kind of generalship that rubbed Grant the wrong way.
Right, I'd agree. And Nate said at Cold Harbor, he did the same thing to a subordinate before his June 3rd attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think that your readers will pick up on without much trouble from my book is that George Meade plays a much larger role in the Petersburg campaign than he's given credit for. Grant depended on Meade a great deal. Grant was hands off. The exception was the 6th Offensive, when he was actually rode out onto the field.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, Grant was back at City Point, giving Meade general directions on what he wanted to accomplish, and would leave it up to George Meade to get it done. And there's a new biography being written by Jennifer Murray on a military biography of Meade, which I think your readers will enjoy when it's finally published.
Absolutely.
But George Meade is I think he gets a short shrift, Tyler. I think he deserves a lot more attention than what history has given him.
No, I'd agree. I'm a little harder on Mead at the Crater than I should be, but that's one of the few areas that I do find a little bit of some fault with Mead. I'm with you for the most part there. I think that Mead absolutely is incredibly important to so much from Wilderness all the way down to Petersburg. And there was someone mentioned a few, I don't remember which historian it was, but I'll always remember this. There's a very famous picture at the Massaponax Church of Grant sort of over Meade's shoulder looking at the map. And I'm like, that's the proverbial image for the rest of the war, if you want to understand George Gordon Meade.
Right.
That
It's not
he's
that Meade didn't make mistakes,
right.
but Grant trusted him, and Meade really directs most of the battles at Petersburg. These are Meade's battles. Grant sets the stage, outlines the objectives, but Meade is making most of the battlefield decisions, except, as they say, for the Sixth Offensive, when Grant uncharacteristically rides out and actually takes control of what's going on out there.
That actually brings us up to our final segment there. I wanted to ask you about a little bit about it. I'm still working my way. I'm a slow reader this time around because this book's just so good. I'm really taking it all in. Fort Harrison is a battle that I really enjoy studying and going to hang, especially if I have the time I'm around Richmond. I always make sure that I either detour or I backtrack to go to Fort Harrison. And I'm very excited to learn a little more about this. But Grant is heavily involved with Fort Harrison. What was it like being able to study that, and what came of being, because this isn't in Petersburg proper. This is north of the
It's
James
part of
again.
the campaign, yeah. It's
Right.
definitely the campaign. It's too bad again that the Park Service, this is not a criticism of the Park Service,
Right.
but they own the fort, but
Mhm.
they don't own the attack ground.
Right.
I think if people can walk that ground leading up to Fort Harrison, you get a much better idea of how powerful that position was. It was very weakly held by the Confederates, but it was a very, very strong position up there. And the attack, was well managed. I mean, that's Butler's attack, and he does a pretty good job. Grant comes up, of course, afterwards. He's very concerned about that, which gives you the insight that things are going on at Petersburg, things are going on north of the James. Where is Grant's focus? And more often than not, it's north of the James. Going back to the crater, Tyler,
Right.
everybody talks about the Federals went across the James River as a diversion. Well, nonsense.
Yeah.
Grant was focused on north of the James. The crater was an afterthought. And for the Fifth Offensive, Grant's presence north of the James would tell you that he was very much interested in success there, and that Meade was playing kind of the second fiddle with his movement to the west from the Weldon Railroad.
That's awesome, and that leads to a string of different. There's a few forts over there, and it's not just Fort Harrison that's attacked, but don't you have Newmarket Heights and Chaffin's Bluff almost in the same assault? Is that the same offensive?
Yeah, same offensive.
Yeah, same offensive.
Um, it's interesting when you drive along that tour road at Richmond National Battlefield Park. When you drive from Route 5, the old River Road, the old Verina Road, down to the river, you're going along earthworks the whole way, but you're going along three different Confederate lines. They look like they're all in one line, but there are three different lines. And I hope that that's a detail for those who are really interested. We'll pick up in volume 2 about the evolution of the Confederate defenses along that high ground north of the James.
Awesome. Well, Will, I wanted to thank you again for joining us today, and we're wrapping up here because I don't want to give too much of Volume 2 away. There's an opportunity for you to read it now. It is out. It was out April 8th, I think is the exact date. It rings true to my head that April 8th was the day that it released. Will said you can pick it up on Amazon or you can go to UNC and pick that up. I guess we have one more question before I go off. It looks like this might be a really good one. So if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read this
Sure.
out because some of it cut off on our picture there. What do you think about Fort Harrison aiding in Lincoln's reelection? I found a source from a New York regiment saying that it was the capture of Atlanta, 3rd Winchester, and Fort Harrison that got Lincoln reelected. However, I understand that they may be trying to prop up their victory. Newspaper reports in the North did seem pretty excited about the capture of that fort.
That's interesting. I didn't find any evidence of Fort Harrison being up there. I would add the capture of Mobile Bay
Mm-hmm.
as part of the tripartite victories on the Union side that dispelled the notion that the war was unwinnable. Fort Harrison was, in a way, was a little bit of a hollow victory because, as you know, the Confederates they make a counterattack the next day, which fails miserably. But they're able to construct a line that cuts off the portion of the Confederate defenses that were captured on September 29th, so that the Confederates were pretty much just as secure after Fort Harrison as they were prior to its capture. So I think your reader or your listener rather is right that it was probably a little bit of homerism there on the part of that soldier,
Mm-hmm.
trying to elevate the victory at Fort Harrison to maybe something it really wasn't.
Awesome. Well, Will, thank you so much again. Looking forward to Volume 3 when that arrives, but I need to finish Volume 2 first before I look forward to anything. It's just been fantastic to read. And again, I really appreciate what you've done to put Petersburg on the map. It's been amazing. And again,
Well, thanks
really,
for
yeah.
having.
And
Appreciate
thanks for being on tonight.
it. Okay.
All right.